What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Strong.Sistas YouTube channel. I'm sure many of you all are aware the health of our nation is declining. So we are having a declining life expectancy. We are having an increase in autoimmune diseases. 1 in every 5 people suffer from an autoimmune condition. And I really think that the declining soil health is playing a huge role in this. So in today's interview, I have a really exciting conversation with Dr. Van Vliet at Duke University, whose research really lies at the intersection of human health and soil health. So in this conversation, we talk about the nutritional differences between grass-fed and grain-fed meat and how meat has phytochemicals. Meat is a health food. It is not bad for us. And then we also dive into the differences between plant-based protein and animal-based protein. I think sometimes we forget how much we don't know about human nutrition and how much more research we have left to do. And so I'm really excited about Dr. Van Vliet's research in the future. He really understands the connection between the soil health and the human health, and how our food is grown and raised plays a role in the nutritional content of that food and then the effects that it has inside of our bodies. So I hope you all enjoy this interview. All right, thank you so much for joining me today for this interview. I'm really excited to share information about your research to our audience. I think that it's really exciting and it's really applicable to a lot of people, especially in this like animal-based eating community. So can you start off by sharing a little bit about who is Dr. Van Vliet? How did I pronounce
it? Van Vliet.
Van Vliet. Who is Dr. Van Vliet?
Yes, thank you so much for having me today. Actually, I'm excited to dive into my research on plant diversity and human health and how that impacts our wellness and our food systems. So I did my PhD at the University of Illinois, and I graduated as an Aspen Fellow in kinesiology. My research was focused on looking at food-derived metabolites, specifically in animal proteins such as dairy, meat, and eggs, and how they impact muscle protein synthesis. From there on, I did a postdoctoral fellowship or postdoctoral research at Washington University in St. Louis. My research was focused on obesity and insulin kinetics, and since 2 years I've been at Duke University, and here my research is really heavily focused on linking food production methods to human health using metabolomics techniques.
Cool. Can you briefly describe what metabolics? Wow, I can't even pronounce it properly.
Metabolomics, yes.
Metabolomics, like what that means.
It means that we look at expanded pools of nutrients within foods. So generally, our knowledge of nutrition is generally focused on the 150 nutritional components that are routinely tracked in USDA nutritional databases. And of those 150, only 13 appear regularly on food labels, which are protein, carbohydrates, sugar, fats, and then we have a distinction between saturated fats, of course, and a handful of vitamins and minerals. But food sources are much more than that. And we like to describe this as the whole food matrix, which can contain several thousand unique metabolites that are capable of impacting human health. And these can be non-protein amino acids, specific fatty acids, but also phytochemicals such as polyphenols and terpenes, carotenoids, tocopherols. And these are all components that can impact human health. And with using metabolomics, and specifically within nutrition domains, which you call food metabolomics, we look at how these nutrients within foods are impacted by production systems and how they subsequently impact human health.
I think that you touched on a lot of great points, and I think that's a great starting point. So much of like our nutritional knowledge right now is macronutrients, so protein, carbs, and fat, and then vitamins and minerals. And like all of those are very important, but I think that your research is demonstrating like there's so much more out there that we don't know, such as phytonutrients. And I know that a lot of people may have heard of this term, and I think a lot of people associate it with just vegetables. Can you briefly cover like what are phytonutrients?
Yeah, so that's a class of nutrients that are generally referred to. I mean, I think the most common term that people have heard are polyphenols. Um, and then other ones are carotenoids, such as beta carotene, which is usually associated with carrots and sweet potatoes. And then also the tocopherols, which have vitamin E activity. And it's really a class of several, or I should say more than 10,000 individual nutrients that do have anti-inflammatory or antioxidant effects. They play a role in heart health, in cognitive function. And I must admit, it is an emerging area of research, or we're sort of scratching the surface on exactly what they do and their importance. But yeah, there is, I would argue, plenty of research out there that suggests that eating a diet that is rich in some of these phytochemicals or phytonutrients can promote health and is disease protective.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people just associate them with plants and, like, for example, like eat your vegetables, eat your fruits, they are high in these nutrients. But your research recently has pointed out that there's actually phytonutrients in meat and dairy. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes, exactly. So when the animal consumes forage, and this is particularly if they consume a wide variety of forage on pasture, so increased biodiversity on pasture, tends to upcycle a lot of these phytonutrients also in the meat and milk of animals. So that provides another avenue by which we can obtain these phytonutrients. And what is particularly interesting about this, and what we're hoping to investigate more in the future, is that obviously ruminants, they can consume vegetation that you and I cannot consume because we don't have the digestive systems to do so. So whether this will allow us to access some other nutrients that we otherwise not have access to, that's a very interesting topic of research. And I definitely want to also reiterate that this does not mean that we should not obtain these phytochemicals from fruits and vegetables either, but rather I want to see them as complementary in our dietary system and our nutrition.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point there. So we are fruits and vegetables certainly do have benefits, and however, we are limited in like which a small group of those as to the wide array of plants that do exist. Some have toxins. We don't have the 4-chamber stomach that ruminants do to break down these tough cell walls. And so we indirectly get these wider array of nutrients because ruminants, who are incredible creatures, if they're grazing on these really diverse pastures, so not monoculture pastures, they're accessing all of these diverse plants, and then indirectly we're consuming those. And it's just something that you would just never think about because, like you said, the USDA food database, they've never tested for these type of things, and they're limited to the macronutrients and then the vitamins and the minerals. Can you talk a little bit about the levels, like, so the comparison in levels between this amount in meat versus the amount in fruits and vegetables?
Yeah, so they're definitely higher if you look at it overall in fruits and vegetables, about 5 to 20-fold higher. But some individual compounds like chlorogenic acid or gallic acid or things like that, you can also obtain those in good amounts from plant foods. And then there are also a wide variety of things that are harder to get, and these have very funky names like alpha-pinene, which is named after, you can already see it after pine trees, and alpha-berberine, which is also a compound that may have antioxidant effects. And so these are individual nutrients that are from plants that you and I would not necessarily consume, and I think that's where a lot of this benefit may be derived from. And then you do see this strong relationship between the level of these compounds in the forage. You see a direct relationship between what is found in the forage and what you find subsequently in the meat and milk. And as you alluded to earlier, if animals are grazing biodiverse pastures, you can see that there's this 3 to 4-fold higher amount of these compounds, these phytonutrients, in the meat and milk of animals versus that are grazing more monoculture pastures, and whereas it's further reduced and sometimes even undetectable in animals that are finished in feedlots.
And I think that there's been a lot of discussion, especially in the last few years, in the animal-based community, where they're saying, a lot of people say there's no difference. There's really isn't much nutritional difference between grass-fed and grain-fed meat. And that's not to say that grain-fed meat isn't nutritious. It is. Like, meat in general has very bioavailable nutrients. However, I think that this type of research is so important to distinguish that, like, hey, for regenerative farmers who are responsibly grazing their animals on diverse pastures with a ton of different cover crop cocktails, so biodiverse species out there, and they're not overgrazing the field, so there's like really good root systems, like
Yep.
those animals are eating really nutritious plants, and so then therefore that's going to show up in the meat. And this is
Yes.
just something that hasn't been talked about because no
No.
one knew that phytonutrients existed in meat. Can you talk a little bit about like some of the problems of like previous research or analyses who said that, hey, there's actually not much difference in grass and grain-fed meat?
Yes, no, that's an excellent question. So I think it has mostly to do with the fact that we just haven't looked for them. And I think it boils back to this where we looked at only a handful of nutrients, and generally the focus is on omega-3 fatty acids and conjugated linoleic acid, which is a trans fatty acid that is found in milk, but also in lower amounts in meat that are produced by rumination of the animal. And there have been various health benefits ascribed to these. The omega-3 fatty acids, obviously, we think of it in the context of fish and salmon, for instance. And I think that's where a lot of these things are coming from, is that we do see higher amounts in grass-fed beef versus grain-fed beef, where but then it's, for instance, compared to something like salmon, and people then sort of say, well, this is maybe not meaningful. But I would not agree with that. And the data also suggests that, and this is work that's been done in Ireland, but also in Australia, where you can see that consuming grass-fed versus grain-fed beef for 10 weeks results in higher circulating levels of these omega-3s in the blood of consumers, which does suggest that they do play a meaningful role. So that's already just looking at omega-3s. I would argue that there are substantial and perhaps important differences. But then it also boils down to the fact that we've generally looked at protein, and there's generally no difference in protein. There is some difference in these omega-3 fatty acids. And then also with regards to vitamins and minerals, there is some suggestion, but again, it just hasn't been studied enough. But there is a paper that would suggest that animals grazing nutrient-rich soils that are rich in minerals, that results in about 2 to 3-fold higher amounts of the B vitamins thiamine and riboflavin in grass-fed meat. So there is some work out there to suggest the relationship between soil health and soil mineral content.
And vitamin E, right?
Yes, correct. Yeah. Yes, indeed. Those like the tocopherols, they also occur in higher amounts. So there is some suggestion of that, but I think one issue is that there haven't been a whole lot of human nutrition studies done on that, so we do not really understand the importance of it. And it's also the focus on just a handful of nutrients that has caused people to overlook the amount of phytonutrients in there. And that's really where the difference starts to appear, because a lot of these phytonutrients appear in very high amounts, or at least relative to grain-fed beef. In grass-fed beef, it can be 5 to 20-fold higher on average, whereas certain compounds are only found in grass-fed beef and not in grain-fed beef. So that's really where these differences start to appear. And what we're looking at now is how does this impact antioxidant responses after eating?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's like, okay, we can analyze the meat samples out of context, like on a plate, but then what about the effects actually in the human body when we consume them? So you're actively working on research right now that's kind of analyzing that?
Yes, that's right. We're starting a project comparing grass-fed beef and grain-fed beef, and also comparing it to a novel plant-based meat alternative. And that's what we're doing is we're overlaying these the food metabolomes. We're looking at these metabolite profiles within the food, and then we're overlaying those with the human metabolome. So we're studying how does the food metabolome impact the human metabolome, and we're looking at if some of these phytonutrients or other metabolites that have potential health effects? Are they appearing in the blood after eating? And I would think that that is the case based on some of the previous work that we did on amino acids and some fatty acids too.
Cool. So I wrote down a few other like potential reasons why there are some downfalls to previous studies and analyses. I just want to see your thoughts on it. So from my understanding, a lot of these studies, like there's a wide array of sampling and testing strategies. And so there really isn't a normalized method to analyze the meat for specific nutrients. And so it's kind of hard to piece together testing strategies that are different. And that includes the sample itself. So if you're going to just sample like a really lean cut versus a cut that has a lot of fat, I looked at a study, and one of them, it said that the sample was a representative core of loin, avoiding pockets of fat. And so I would imagine that one of the biggest differences you're going to see is the nutrients in the fat for a lot of these fat soluble vitamins. Where are the differences in these phytonutrients? Like where do the phytonutrients, where are they stored in the body? Is it more in the muscle or is it more in the fat?
A lot of it is a lot of those are fat soluble. They're also stored in the muscle, but yeah, a lot of them are fat soluble for sure. Things like terpenes, for instance, which are sort of the essential oils of the plant community. That's what we know them, often from. People would know them from essential oils. They contain a lot of terpenes, and yeah, so those things are fat soluble. So that's definitely a consideration. So in our work, we're using fattier cuts at the moment, like brisket or ground beef that is about 15% fat, to look at some of these compounds, and later on we hope to compare them to more leaner cuts, like a steak, for instance, and see if there's differences there. But to your point, yeah, there are differences in sampling, and what also is shown is that there's also large differences across farms. For instance, one study that came out suggested that the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio in some samples of grass-fed beef may be close to 1-to-1, but in other samples it may be 28-to-1, which means that there's a lot of omega-6s in grass-fed beef, which you perhaps would not expect, right? That's about the same amount you would find in most feedlot beef. And that has to do with also the regulations on grass-fed beef, or the definition, which is very loose. And for instance,
lack of regulations.
Yes, exactly. So what some farmers can do within that is for instance, still feed soybean husks to animals and finish them on that, which may result in higher amounts of omega-6s. And also other byproducts, and then to the point made earlier, when an animal is grazed on a monoculture pasture, that would also constitute grass-fed beef, but it does not come nearly close to the phytochemical profile when an animal has maybe access to 50 or 60 plants on pasture and can consume a wide array of different plants. But those would all be labeled grass-fed beef to the consumer. So it's hard to know for the consumer exactly what they're getting unless they rely on some sort of third-party verification. But better yet, I would say build a relationship with your farmer, because farmers are usually very proud of their product, and they'll generally gladly tell you about how the animals were raised and what the pasture they had access to. So. But yeah, that is definitely an issue now, and I think the issue is further complicated by all these different labels that we have. We have free range, we have organic, we have grass fed, and they're all a little bit meaningless in the sense that I think when people think of organic milk, they obviously think that they are getting milk, and they're probably picturing animals grazing out on green, luscious pastures, right?
Yeah.
But a lot of organic milk is now produced in feedlots in Texas, for instance, that are more they're finished on organic feed, but that does not necessarily mean that it's grass fed, right? And even within grass fed, it's loose, because it could also mean just finishing on grass pallets or on monoculture pastures, which do not have the same type of diversity. For instance, the label organic. For it to be labeled organic, the animals need to have access to pasture 120 days out of the year during the grazing season, and only about 30% of their diet needs to come from pasture forages. So that is obviously not per se you're not per se getting grass-fed milk or meat in that case.
Yeah, I think our audience knows, like, I am a huge proponent of knowing your farmer. So using the website www.eatwild.com, going to look at the farm, asking the farmer about his or her practices. Because I think this is Fred Provenza's quote. He said, grass-fed is not grass-fed is not grass-fed. So like, grass-fed has been greenwashed. There's no regulations on it. And your research is really showing that the more skillfully a farmer manages their pasture, the more nutrients the meat is going to have. And so developing that relationship, finding your local regenerative farmer and asking him or her about their practices. So do they know about holistic management? Do they know about adaptive multi-paddock grazing?
Yeah.
Grass-fed animals sitting on the same pasture all year round with continuous grazing with grasses the size of golf courses, like, that's not good. There's no nutrients in those forages.
No. Yeah.
And like you said, there's no no one's coming to the farm to see what they're actually finishing the cows on. And especially pasture raised, every cow in the United States spends a significant amount of their life on pasture. So pasture raised can apply to feedlot finished beef sometimes too. So with all this greenwashing occurring, how are you making sure in your studies that you're actually sourcing from very diverse pastures that aren't monocrop, that aren't continuously grazed?
Yeah, well, we're sourcing from both to get after that research question. So, but we generally also start to collect plant samples to directly work with the farmers, and we also know the farmers, so we always visit the farms and to look at some of their practices. But yeah, we're interested in doing these comparisons because a lot of this work has been traditionally done in Europe, specifically Italy and France, because they operate a larger pasture-based model, where some of this initial work also comes from, and inspired us to do so in North American systems too. But yeah, to your point, indeed, it is important that some of these things get hashed out, and that we learn more about how pasture diversity impacts human health. And we also, what we're essentially trying to do is that a lot of farmers and also scientists that work in that field, when they see an increase in soil health, right, and in plant biodiversity, presumably that would increase, will have a positive benefit also on the nutrient density of the meat and milk that is produced, or even if you grow crops, it will still have a positive benefit. But it's really that disconnect between the fields of agriculture and human health, where we sort of have been working in silos. So it sort of stops at the field of agriculture, and then in human health, we sort of do not connect to the farmers as much, and we're looking at more the other way towards medicine and pharmaceuticals to start treating diseases of dietary origin. So I think it's very valuable to start working with soil scientists and agricultural scientists, which is what we're doing, and really start to make this connection between soil health, plant biodiversity, the nutrient density of meat and milk, and human health, and to study the transfer of these nutrients along this continuum.
Yeah. I posted on Instagram the other day that, like, our life expectancy in the United States is declining. We have like the highest rates of autoimmunity that we've ever seen. Like 1 in every 5 people have an autoimmune condition. We are an obese and malnourished nation. And I just fully believe that one of the biggest reasons for that is the decline in soil health and how industrial agriculture practices rely so much on synthetics. And we're not getting the vast array of nutrients that are present in the soil that we can tap into. And so a lot of our food is significantly lower in nutrients relative to, I think, like the 1940s. We have to eat 2 to 3 times more meat 3 to 4 times more fruits and vegetables to obtain the same amount of nutrients as we
Yeah.
did back then.
Yeah, no, that with the micronutrients, that is definitely seems to be the case. Yeah, that we see this decrease, or if you build soil health, this increase. So, and yeah, I mean that part is pretty well established. Like I said earlier, if you have more polyphenols in your plant, you're going to have more of it in your appearing in the animal, if you provide the animal eat the plant, or if we eat it ourselves.
Yeah.
And the same is then, but where the black box begins is then the connection to human health. So there have been a few studies done related to human health, but it is really sparse. And there was, for instance, one study that looked, it was an Italian study, and they had pecorino cheese, which is cheese from sheep that were raised on pastures, biodiverse pastures in Tuscany, Italy. And they compared it to more store-bought grain-fed cheese. And what they found was that after 10 weeks of consumption, and this was about half a pound of cheese a week, they noticed a reduction in markers of inflammation and oxidative stress. And inflammation and oxidative stress are important in human health, and they're using underlying factor of many modern diseases, such as heart disease or even neurocognitive diseases. Also obesity and diabetes. So they saw a reduction in that, but then there's also been other studies comparing grass-fed versus grain-fed beef, and this was a study done in the US that, for instance, found no differences between eating grass-fed or grain-fed beef 4 times a week, eating a 4-ounce patty. And yeah, it's hard to say because none of these studies really give a detailed description of the phytonutrients, meaning they did not use the techniques that we use to look at the phytonutrients. So it's a little bit of speculation in that sense. All we know is that in the study on grain-fed versus grass-fed beef that was done out of Texas, the animals were more grazing what you would typically think of as a monoculture pasture, whereas the study in Tuscany, Italy, the animals, at least from the description, would have access to a wide array of phytochemically rich plants. And then there's another study that's commonly, perhaps some of you listeners know about, is the kangaroo study out of Australia, that is usually cited in favor of why grass-fed meat may be better. And what the authors did was they fed the participants kangaroo or Wagyu beef, which is grain-finished beef and generally pretty fatty. And they also found that inflammation acutely after the meal was reduced with the kangaroo meat, and the kangaroo obviously foraging on native pastures. But an issue obviously with that study is that the animals were confounded, it's a different animal, and the fat content was confounded, and also the fact that I'm talking to you about the kangaroo meat as evidence for potentially eating grass-fed meat, or why it may or may not be healthier, also tells us about the state of the literature, that there's definitely a need to start connecting the dots regarding the phytochemical richness of animals that were finished on biodiverse pastures, and see if this has an appreciable health effect on us as humans.
So it sounds like there is not a study yet done comparing the post-meal inflammation markers like these other studies tested between a grass-fed animal that is feeding on a very diverse pasture that's rotationally grazed versus grain-fed meat with similar fat content. So yes. I'm guessing that's kind of what you guys are working towards in your lab.
That is correct. Yes, that's what we're doing. We've sourced beef from a farm that we visited about a year ago, also with Fred Provenza, and then another colleague, a livestock scientist, Scott Kronberg. And this is from a farmer. His name is Glenn Alzinga. He's in Idaho, and he grazes his cattle in the mountains on public lands there. But he ranches them, so he's think of it as a cowboy that is with his animals 24/7, and yeah, they have access to about 150 plants during the summer. So and this is really sort of the most diverse beef we could get. So we're starting to test that, and then we're testing that, comparing that to grain-fed beef. But in our metabolomics analysis, we're also comparing it to monoculture beef, and at some point we hope to sort of go from the one extreme to the next, and then look at everything in between too, as we expand this research. But yes, first we're looking at sort of the two extremes to get a feel for what some of the potential differences are, and then the third arm of that is also looking at some of these novel plant-based meat alternatives, which are touted as environmentally friendlier and healthier as meat than meat, and so we're also looking at those and seeing if there's an effect there, and insofar they are good nutritional substitutes for meat, and which we can go dive into in a bit too, because we have some metabolomics data on that too.
Yeah, I want to put a pin on that because I want to get back to that, because I think that that's
Sure.
a really important discussion. But just one more question about the nutritional differences. So I'm a big believer of nose to tail nutrition. I think that eating the organ parts is very sustainable, and then it's also really nutritious. You're going to get some really bioavailable nutrients. Like I have liver every day. I try to have as many like other organ parts. Is there any data documenting the difference in nutrients in organ parts between truly grass-fed on biodiverse pastures and grain-fed?
There is some data in lambs, specifically in lamb liver, and you do see a very high. So some of the things you can measure is you can measure a total polyphenol content with some of the assays, and you do see that the nutrient density is about, or the antioxidant capacity, I should say, is about 4 times higher compared to muscle meat, and also compared to grain-fed liver. There's also a large difference, and this is really where, also coming back to the fatty acids, where we talked about earlier, when people sometimes say there's not an appreciable differences in the essential fatty acids like EPA and DHA. Well, actually in the liver, that's where the differences are really large, because you might find about 100 milligrams of DHA in 100 grams of grass-fed liver, which is starting to get sort of close to the fatty fish levels at that point. So grass-fed liver is very high, and it's about 10 times higher in DHA than grain-fed liver. So you see large differences there. Definitely also richer in antioxidants, and so liver has been studied most in that regard. And yeah, there are some unique compounds found in liver that have health promoting effects, and also, yeah, I do think it's important. Also, I agree with you, eating nose to tail to do that, also just from an out of respect for the animal, and from an environmental perspective even, right? Because a lot of what we are looking at regarding the emissions, and whether we can use a pasture-based model to support our nutrient intake, that usually takes into account prime cuts like steaks and roasts and ground beef, but it generally does not take into account organ meat. And for instance, there was a study done in Germany showing that if we were to eat organ meats regularly, this would already lower our or at least the greenhouse gas emissions, which is generally expressed as a CO2 equivalent of per kg of or per pound of beef. It would lower it with 15%. So because you obviously get more out of the animal. And one argument that you could also make is that you could eat less of it and still get a much higher amount of micronutrients, right? So if we're not just looking at protein here or fat, but looking specifically at micronutrients or some of these phytochemicals, which are definitely higher in liver, then yes, eating small amounts of liver can give you a lot of bang for your buck.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so I think to like wrap up like the grass-fed versus grain-fed discussion, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm provide like a brief summary and like some takeaway points. So the claims that have been made previously that there's not enough nutritional difference between grain-fed and grass-fed, that may have been a little bit too early to make that claim because there's a lot that we don't know out there. For example, you are finding there's phytochemicals in meat and they're significantly higher in grass-fed. And also you have to be really careful with how we define grass-fed, because someone who grazes cows on a pasture that is continuously grazed, has single species of grass, is going to be very nutritionally different than someone who practices adaptive multi-paddock grazing on very biodiverse pastures. And so we are not saying that grain-fed meat isn't nutritious. It's just simply not as nutritious as grass-fed. And I think that your research is so important for small regenerative farmers, because they have a really hard time selling their meat these days, because people are saying, hey, there's not that much of a nutritional difference. And how many people out there are actually going to buy meat that's more expensive, that's just better for the environment, right?
Yeah.
So I think that that's a hard sell. And so this really helps these small regenerative farmers who can say, no, like our meat is better for you and it's better for the environment because we take extra care of our grasses and our pastures. And so I just like, I'm so excited about your research, and like I applaud you so much, because I think that it is going to really help this regenerative agriculture movement and these small farmers, because I think that ultimately a lot of these environmental problems are going to come at the purchasing power of consumers. And so the more consumers that we can get that are educated about these topics and go to www.eatwild.com and find your local farmer and support them, I think the better that we're going to be.
Yeah, no, I could not agree more. And indeed, that is the main takeaway is indeed connect with your farmer if you want to find some of this beef and learn about their practices. And indeed, I do want to highlight that sort of the way I approach it is that meat and milk, irrespective of how it's raised, grain-fed or grass-fed, contribute strongly to nutrient adequacy. If all you can afford is grain-fed beef or milk, then especially if you're in a lower socioeconomic status, that 2 pounds of ground beef that you can afford every week is probably one of the most nutrient-dense foods that you are consuming, and probably some of the healthiest foods. So that's also why I'm always getting a little bit nervous about when we hear these things like we need to tax meat or we need to discourage it. Then I'm always thinking like this is gonna disproportionately hit the people or affect the people that probably benefit the most from having some of this in their diet, and even within the US, but also definitely elsewhere in the world, obviously, where a lot of people depend strongly on livestock grazing to contribute to their meat and milk, so or their livelihood in general. So I think those are important considerations, and indeed those differences that people usually mention between grass-fed and grain-fed meat and milk. It's just because it's sort of sometimes it's referred to as the streetlight effect. If you lose your keys, you're going to look for them in the streetlight, right? But maybe your keys, if they're not in the streetlight, you're not going to find them. So it's sort of looking at these expanded pools, and that's really where the differences are. If you look at a handful of nutrients, then you can make the case, okay, there's no difference. But if you look at sort of the whole food matrix, and I don't want to make it seem like we have mapped out the whole food matrix, because I would argue that we're even scratching the surface with some of this work on these phytonutrients. But we're really seeing, when we open ourselves up to looking at these expanded pools, that's where really, if you look at 1,000 nutrients, okay, then all of a sudden we see these major differences. And now it's figuring out how does this relate back to soil health, and how does this the other side relate back to human health.
Yeah, that's great. I'm really excited about your upcoming research, and I think that that's like a great transition into next question, which you brought up, like this kind of fear of like meat tax and reducing the amount of meat consumption can really potentially have negative consequences on human health. And so I know that some of your previous and ongoing research is kind of comparing the differences between like meat and these plant-based alternatives. Can you discuss a little bit about the current research that's out there? Basically, like the bioavailability and whether or not, like, if there's enough research out there to say one is superior than the other.
Yeah, so We published a paper about 6 years ago now, where we looked in depth at some of the animal source proteins versus plant proteins. And what we found there, if you look at protein itself, we see that generally plant proteins are lower in either one or two essential amino acids, which are amino acids that we must consume from our diet because we cannot produce them ourselves. Typically lysine or methionine, and we call it a rate limiting amino acid. And as a result of that, you generally get a lower muscle building response, because our muscle proteins constantly need to be renewed. And we're not only talking about if you want to lift weights and grow some muscle, but also just every protein in your body, in your cell, needs to be renewed. So we generally find a lower response for that when you compare, for instance, equivalent amounts of protein. Some of the things that you may do to improve that are combining various plant proteins. But there was a interesting study that came out recently that showed that even making a complete protein by blending various plant proteins still did not result in a similar amount of amino acids becoming available in the blood after eating, versus in this case it was a dairy protein. So there's a little bit more work to be done there, and definitely some of these novel plant-based meat alternatives, they use isolated protein sources such as pea protein isolate or soy protein isolate, which is their main ingredient. And those are more digestible than maybe just eating like peas or soybeans itself. So their digestibility is closer to animal proteins, but from some of the previous comparisons, not specifically done with these burgers, but with their main ingredients such as soy protein versus an equivalent amount of protein from meat, you do see a lower protein synthetic response after eating. And then to the point is that is just focused on protein, but we also run metabolomics analysis recently on a popular plant-based meat alternative that has an identical or nearly identical nutrition label to meat, meaning that if you look at it and as a consumer, you might not be able to tell the difference. And they actually did
like carbs, fat, protein. Like if you were to
yes.
just compare the limited, like zoom in way, like we were talking about, like there's a lot more nutrients that are important for human health. But if we zoom into just the nutrition facts, we're going to compare the carb, fat, protein, and you're comparing two identical.
Yes, exactly. So one of the novel plant-based meat alternatives has a nutrition label that is so the nutrient facts panel. So if I pick up a package of both and I hold it next to beef, I would not barely be able to tell the difference. And also a recent food survey found that more than 50% of consumers could not tell the difference, and obviously thought that the plant-based burger was healthier, because we think plants are healthier to consume than meat, because that's what we've been told for the last 30 to 40 years, right? And I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that, and they can be complementary to health, but yes. So based on a very limited amount of nutrients, you can think that they are the same as consumers. And also I've heard several CEOs of plant-based meat companies say this, is that they generally, their mantra is meat is made out of amino acids, out of fats, vitamins, and minerals. And we can make all these things from plants. But that is sort of what we would call a textbook example of nutritional reductionism, which is dumbing down foods to its individual constituents and to a very limited number of individual constituents, because food is much more than just a handful of vitamins, minerals, amino acids, and fats. So we tested that using metabolomics and found actually a 90% difference between beef and a plant-based meat alternative, which could not be determined from their nutrition facts panels, which suggest they are nutritionally identical. But again, we looked at these expanded pools of nutrients, such as phytonutrients, also looked at additional vitamins and minerals, looked at fatty acids, looked at non-protein amino acids, like things like taurine or anserine, cysteamine, carnosine, which are all play potentially important roles in human physiology and human health. They, for instance, have neurocognitive effects, meaning they help with brain health. They have antioxidant effects, anti-inflammatory effects. And often we think of these nutrients as non-essential or conditionally essential, but which you could argue that is the case, but it does not mean that they're not important for human health. So if we only look at it from a very simplistic viewpoint, then maybe you could argue they're the same. But if you actually peel back the onion layer a little bit, then they're day and night difference. It's literally, there's no overlap. Is what we found in our analysis. Is literally we do what we call a principal component analysis in metabolomics. Is meaning we put all these samples in a software program, and then we have all these metabolites, and then we have the program figure out which samples clusters together. And if there will be overlap, then the plant-based samples and the beef samples, they will be all overlapping and they'll all be intermixed. But we literally saw that on the left side, there were all the beef samples, and on the right side were all the plant samples. And there was absolutely a day and night difference between the two. So yeah, that is important to note that I would argue that at least when going beyond this reductionist approach, that a plant-based meat alternative is not a one-to-one nutritional replacement to meat. And I think that is important for consumers to know, because a lot of consumers may not think that's the case, because that's not what the nutrition facts panels tell them, or what maybe some of the messaging out there would tell them.
Yeah. So you said there was a 90% difference. So just to make sure, this is the 90% difference in just analyzing the meat, not yet on the effects of actual consumption in the human body.
Yeah, these are just looking at the nutrient density of these products using a food metabolomics approach, and you get a variety of nutrients, but you also pick up other metabolites that are we are not 100% sure of what their impacts are on human health, but we did pick up a large amount of amino acids, fatty acids, phenolic compounds like carotenoids, tocopherols, that have a difference, and various bioactive peptides that do have an impact. So yeah, we have to evaluate this in human work. And there was a study that came out recently. This was about I think earlier in the year. It was an 8-week study that compared Beyond Meat to grass-fed beef. This was on top of an omnivorous diet, and 2.5 servings a day of meat were replaced with Beyond Meat products. And in that case, there was there was some more weight loss on the Beyond Meat products, but there were no real large differences in any of the lipoprotein profiles, such as cholesterol. But yeah, so it's hard to say now what the health effects are. I would argue that if someone wants to consume a plant-based patty 2 or 3 times a week as part of an omnivorous diet, I'm not sure if that's going to have an appreciable health effects on the consumer. We also have to be realistic, right? It's when you think of these high amounts, but yeah, to your point, if it's and especially in vulnerable populations like children or elderly, if all of their meat would, let's say if you have an 8-year-old child and you would replace all their meat with a plant-based meat alternative, thinking that this is healthier or would contribute to nutrient adequacy, in that cases, I would exert a little bit more caution, and because you're not getting the same products, you are getting much different nutrients. So that and I think that is very important to see. And we're going to compare the metabolome profiles, but my guess would be is that if we see such these large differences in the food metabolome, which is where the 90% difference is, that we might also see large differences in circulating metabolomes in the consumer.
Yeah. That I think is going to be really important information to come out, because you have this plant-based agenda coming out that just points at meat as a negative health food. It has all these health consequences, and that's just like simply not the case. And I think a lot of people forget that I'm an omnivore as well. I consume produce, but a lot of these like protein plant sources have a lot of accompanying anti-nutrients and potential like digestion inhibitors.
Yeah.
and that can affect things inside the body. And like you said, they have limited, they don't have, it's not full protein, it's not a complete protein. It doesn't
No.
have all the amino acids that we need, whereas meat and milk do. It's almost like, why would we choose the less efficient way? And I think that this tie to the environment and how these plant-based alternatives are better for the environment and better for human health is just like completely misdirected. But I don't know if there's enough research right now to like fully point to that. And so I think that that's like your really important studies coming out are going to make the claim, hey, like meat is actually a health food. Like it has phytonutrients, and this plant-based alternative is not the best option.
Yeah, no, and for sure. And there have been several, it's important to know that where some of this data comes from why red meat is unhealthy and why you all see all these headlines, it's largely based on epidemiological associations, which means that we would ask someone, what did you consume over the last 12 months? How often do you consume beef? How often do you consume vegetables? How often do you consume potato products and things like that? So it's just an insight in your food. And then people are generally followed over 10 to 20 years, and then they develop metabolic disease, and then we're going to relate it back to maybe the meat that they indicated they were consuming 10 or 20 years ago, right? And there's usually follow-ups. But so this is epidemiological associations, which it's difficult sometimes, because what you generally see is that there is an increased risk in disease when meat is consumed as part of a standard American diet, which is also rich in ultra-processed foods. So think of it, hamburgers from a fast food chain that is consumed with French fries and Coke. Whereas if you look at various epidemiological studies that study meat and as part of a sort of a quote unquote healthy whole foods based diet, you see that these associations completely dissolve, meaning that the disease risk either becomes neutral, or especially this in some African countries and in Asian countries, in cohorts done there, where meat actually becomes protective of disease risk, and especially in older individuals, because we sometimes hear these sort of romanticized version of blue zones, right, where people are supposedly all on plant-based diets. Well, even in the Okinawans, you see that people that consume a little bit more animal foods at older age actually have better health outcomes. And these findings are also made in blue zones in Cyprus and in Greece and in Turkey. So there is definitely an advantage to consuming these foods, and generally there also is for people that just raise their own livestock, right? They have their own goats or their own livestock that are generally raised on pasture. So those are also some of the nuance, and there's absolutely no epidemiological research suggesting, or at least that asks consumers, hey, did you consume? Is this meat coming from organic or pasture raised sources? So we can't really say anything about that. But yeah, there have been several randomized controlled trials that follow people over maybe 12 or 16 weeks that show if you consume meat as part of a Mediterranean diet or another like a DASH diet or another sort of quote unquote healthy diet that is rich in whole foods, then you generally don't see any of these cardiometabolic risk markers get any worse, and the same with epidemiological data. So in that context, often forgotten, right? It's usually these very simplistic messages. Red meat is bad for you, but it's sort of destroying the environment. Like by eating it yourself, you kill yourself, and producing it, you kill everyone else. Is sort of sometimes the mantra, and it's so much more nuanced than that. And we hope to at least contribute by looking at some of how pasture-based models do that, because yeah, I do think with all these concerns about environmental and human health impacts, I do think that consumers over time will yes start to at least demand that animals are raised out on pasture, and that it's done with low input, right? Because you're using cover crops or having animals graze marginal lands, and even feeding some of this phytochemically rich agri waste, the byproducts from fruit and vegetable production. Those are all opportunities to sort of reintegrate crop and livestock systems, which we moved away from after the Green Revolution. we're realizing that hey, maybe using synthetic fertilizers and taking animals and crop systems like plants, taking them, sort of like separating them, is completely unnatural, because nature has introduced great biodiversity, but mankind is poised to simplify it, probably because the only way we can understand it. But yeah, now I think we're seeing a return to that, and it's really interesting to see if that also improves the healthfulness, which based on our initial data, it would suggest that it does.
A follow-up there would be, are there any is there research out there pointing the difference in the bioavailability of that protein? You hear that term a lot, right? Like meat, animal protein is a lot more bioavailable than plant protein.
Yes, yeah, that is fairly well established that indeed animal proteins are more bioavailable than plant proteins. If you use isolated plant proteins like pea protein isolate or soy protein isolate, where some of these anti-nutrients are and the fiber is removed, you do see that they get closer to the animal proteins. But then there's still the issue of a sort of quote unquote unbalanced amino acid profile. And we don't fully understand why. Yeah, you see some of these differences, because even with some of the complete amino acid profiles from plant proteins, there was recent work showing that indeed the amino acid profile after a complete plant protein is still lower in the blood. And then there's also what you see is an increase in wasting of amino acids from plant proteins for energy production. You see a greater production of urea and a greater oxidation rates. And you also see an increase in protein synthesis in the splanchnic bed, which is the gut and the liver. And we're not 100% sure why that's the case. I mean, we speculated that maybe because the body is sort of seeing an unbalanced amino acid profile, that it's upregulating protein synthesis in vital organs such as the liver at the expense of muscle, because it thinks there's maybe like a shortage or a famine coming up. So it's upregulating essential organs and lowering it in the muscle. But yeah, we not 100% sure yet, but there is definitely lower bioavailability with plant proteins. One important thing to notice is if you eat enough protein, about 1.6 grams per kilogram body weight per day of protein. It doesn't matter whether you consume animal or plant proteins. At that point, you're consuming so many amino acids that it becomes a wash. But then circling back to the point of we're just focused on amino acids, right? But what are some of the other key nutrients that you're missing out on? So it's because foods are so much more than just protein. Because I also more like to talk to in the term of like animal foods or plant foods, because proteins sort of suggest that these things are interchangeable, but they're not, because they're complementary in the diet. I believe that's the case, and they're not just interchangeable, which sort of the term animal plant protein sometimes suggests.
Yeah. Again, like there's limitations in this, like if it fits your macros, calorie is a calorie, carb, fat, and protein discussion, where like calories still do matter. The amount of calories that you consume still matters, but it's just a very zoomed in view of human nutrition. One thing that I'm a little bit concerned about in the future is cultured meat. So it's like taking bovine cells, so ruminant cells, and then growing it into muscle and fat tissue in the lab. And so these companies are saying, hey, we don't have to kill any animals for this, and you're still getting meat. Is there, I imagine there isn't much research out there yet, but what are your concerns as to, one, like what are they using to grow the muscle meat? So you have the cells, what are they using to grow the muscle meat? And then like how the nutrient differences between actual muscle meat grazed out on good pasture and these lab grown?
Yeah, that will be my main concern, the nutritional differences, because as we discussed, an animal out on pasture might consume 50 or 100 different plants that are very rich in phytochemicals, and my concern is how are you going to get those in the cell-grown meat, right? It's again sort of focused on this simplified approach nutrition, this nutritional reductionism, where we dumb the nutrients down to its individual constituents. And I'm sure lab-based meat will be closer to the real thing, to actual meat, than a plant-based meat alternative. But yeah, I mean, there's no data on this right now, but that would be my major concern: is can we truly replicate the biochemical and phytochemical complexity in meat? And at the moment, yeah, it requires fetal bovine serum, which is from a live calf, so it's not the prettiest way of getting that, because you have to get it from a live animal and remove its serum. But and then the use of antibiotics. But they're working. I mean, the companies that are working on cell-based meat are working hard on replacing that, and I'm sure at some point it will be using maybe some plant materials to in the media. I also think that at some point it will probably be sold in grocery stores. But if we can compare it to some of the non dairy milks, right? They have a role in our food system. They're in the supermarket shelves, but they have not fully replaced dairy, actually, from animals. So I suspect something like that will happen with maybe some of the meat. And yeah, I always like to compare it to this: is that we tried to ban alcohol in about every country in the world, and people couldn't live without alcohol and started making it themselves. So good luck trying to severely reduce meat consumption or even ban meat from people, because unlike alcohol, meat does provide many essential nutrients known to life. We've been consuming it for about 2 to 3, or at least 1.5 to 2 million years. So I'm not sure if that's going to fully replace our animal meats. And I think, yeah, or at least that's my positive thinking. But I'm sure they'll have market value at some point.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's so much investment dollars going into this cultured meat right now. There's no doubt that it'll come out in supermarkets at some point. But I really like your thought of like, it may just be the new almond milk. So like almond milk versus like real milk from cows, like so much more nutritious. Cultured meat versus actual meat, so much more nutritious. But it'll be there. Probably.
Yeah, just be a different product, I think. Yeah. And there's also so many nuances to it, because obviously, yes, maybe if you look at it from a simplistic view of looking at the environmental footprint, and maybe people would argue sometimes that it has a lower environmental footprint. I think it's much more nuanced than that, and with some of the metrics that we use on the way of we express greenhouse gas emissions and the timeline, which we won't go into, but it's also this nuance. If you grow animals on pasture and it's all self-sustainable, whereas the feed stuff come from the pasture, or it comes from cover crops, or any residue from harvested crops, and the water is mostly coming from rainfall, and it's all self-sufficient and integrated, then obviously you need little to no input, right, to produce beef. So then if you compare it to that, then maybe the cell-based meat is pretty intensive and resource intensive. So that's also the case that we made in a review paper on comparing plant-based meats, where the comparison tends to be to grain-fed beef. And then if you look at CO2 equivalents, then yes, maybe they're 10 times as high in grain-fed beef. But then if you look at it versus grass-fed beef maybe lower, or in some cases even have a net negative carbon footprint, at least when it's attributed to cattle. So those are some of these important nuances that it's never black and white. But yeah, there's just I think a lot more money to be made in some of these cell-based meats and plant-based meat alternatives, whereas the model we just described with an integrated crop livestock system, I mean, what is there to sell other than knowledge? Nothing really. So
yeah, how can these big companies make money in regenerative agriculture, holistically grazed cattle operations? They can't.
Yeah, well, I'm hoping to think that as climate change is a real issue, a real concern, and for these companies, it will also be. You see McDonald's and General Mills and some other companies that are known moving into this space, because and they're really at the forefront of doing this. Because obviously the companies also want a steady supply of food, and if the crops, or even with some of the grains fed to animals, if they're destroyed due to another blizzard or tornado and things like that, and even if when soil health diminishes, right, because we eroded the soils, I mean, they also want a steady supply of high quality products. And that is, I think, what regenerative agriculture can provide to these companies. So I do think that there will be an interest in this moving forward, because you're able to spread the risk, you're able to improve your soil health, so you become more resilient to climate change. And I think that's where some of these big companies will also see a role for regenerative agriculture.
Yeah, I applaud General Mills for their initial steps in investing and being interested in regenerative agriculture. I think that that's an exciting path to follow in the future. But thank you so much for coming on to the channel here. I think that your research is so important because it's the first that I know of that's really at the intersection of soil health and human health. And I think too often those are kind of measured separately. And so I'm really excited to follow your progress forward with all of your exciting research coming out. Where can people find out more information about you, follow along your research?
Yeah, so my Twitter handle is at Van Vliet PhD. That is my last name. So that's spelled VanVliet. Also, if you just Google my name, Stephan van Vliet PhD or Dr. Van Vliet, you'll find my website and my Google Scholar profile, where you can also follow my work. But yeah, whenever we have a new study come out, or some of the things that we're working on, I try to be active on Twitter and post our work there. And yeah, no, it will definitely be exciting to see what happens moving forward with the connection between soil health, plant diversity, animal health, and human health. So thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to discuss our research.
No, thank you so much for everything that you do. I really appreciate it.